This is Sephardic World, brought to you by the Sephardic Genealogical Society. We welcome our patrons who are here with us on Zoom and who make all these meetings happen with their continuing support. We welcome our viewers on YouTube, and we especially welcome our speaker, George Sacherdot. In his book, Remembrance and Renewal, George traced the history of five Italian Jewish families back to the 1400s. In this talk, he will share elements of their histories and the way he reconstructed their story from documents scattered all over Italy. The talk will run from the 1400s up to the liberation from the ghettos in 1848. George was born in the United States into an Italian Jewish family. His upbringing was bicultural and included summers in Italy. He received a PhD in mathematics and, after a brief academic career, worked in management consulting. He published works apart from the already mentioned Remembrance and Renewal, uh, Memories of Memories, and the Wisdom of Leonie Levy, one of the last people to know everything about almost everything. George will now speak to you about 5 centuries of five Italian Jewish family. Welcome, George.
Thank you, Ton, for that very kind introduction. And thank you also to David Mendoza and Ron Gomez Caceres for assistance in organizing this talk. And for all, I wish you a happy Passover as we celebrate our freedom from bondage. And we must also think about the families of the captives, of the wounded, and of the dead in recent conflicts in the Middle East. I'm delighted to be able to share with you part of a family story that I built over a period of years. This talk will be in part storytelling and part discussions of how the story was assembled. But before I begin, let me add in a few details of my own personal background. While I sound like an American, I grew up in the United States, my first language was actually Italian. My parents, older brothers, and one of my grandmothers left Italy in early 1939 following the introduction of the racial laws, settling in France, and then escaping from France in late May of 1940 at the time of Dunkirk. After the war, my grandmother returned to Italy, recovered her property, including her beloved country villa in the hills overlooking Turin. It had been occupied by the German army during the war and mercifully was not destroyed despite their orders to burn everything. I wound up spending many summers there and thus grew up totally bicultural. When my mother died about 20 years ago, my brother and I discovered that we had a treasure trove of family documents and memorabilia, some of them going back as nearly 2 centuries. And somehow these objects and these documents had found their way to America. My brother looked at me and said that we, meaning I, should write a family history for our children. As I began my research effort, this effort turned into a 500-year saga about which I will talk today. In the interest of time, I'm going to cut the story short in the middle of the 1800s, although half of the given book here discusses events that happened since that time, the first generation post-ghetto, the fascist period, the war period, and the scattering of the family on multiple continents as a result. By the way, the picture on the cover of the book includes members of all five of the families. I hadn't realized that until I was preparing this talk, but in fact, we have 5 different families represented in that picture. One last item, a small housekeeping item. I would prefer to take questions at the end of the talk, and if possible, to ask you to mention the slide number in question to help us refer back to the right part of the talk. Okay. Oh, here we go. In this talk, I'm going to focus on the Jews in Italy. And there are sort of 3 main takeaways. One, which I will spend exactly 1 slide, is that there have been Jews in Italy for a very long time. Secondly, because Italy was situated in the middle of the Mediterranean, has been a major commercial center connecting north and south, east and west since antiquity. There are Jewish communities who follow all of the different Jewish rites represented in Italy. And in past, they often kept semi-separate lives, even if they were living in similar neighborhoods or close by neighborhoods. And given the particular interest of this group in genealogy, this is the main takeaway of this talk, is that there's a vast amount of documentary material from the Middle Ages to the present in Italy with which to build detailed family histories, community histories, and to learn important lessons from the past. And I will illustrate how I have mined some of this material to capture many centuries worth of stories about these 5 ancestral families, 3 Sephardic, 1 Italian going back to the time of the Caesars, and 1 Ashkenazi from a family that settled in Italy in the 1400s. Okay, the 5 families are the families that are in the gray box on the upper left 2/3 of the page.
We're still seeing the first slide.
You're still seeing the first slide.
Yes.
This is not, oh, why is this not paging through? I'm going to unshare and reshare. If you just bear with me for one moment. Why is this not coming up? Okay. Is this paging correctly now?
Yeah. Yes, you're now on the second slide.
Very good. Okay, so Emanuele Sacerdote, my great-grandfather, my father's grandfather, was descended from a man named Abram Vidal de Sacerdotibus, who left Valencia in 1490 and settled in, arrived in Italy shortly thereafter. Emanuele himself was born in the ghetto. After the ghetto, he became a lawyer, a property investor, a philanthropist, and was granted a knighthood. The second fellow, Salvador Montalcini, his family was documented already in Cecil Roth's book of the Jews of Italy, published in the 1940s. He himself, the family was from Rome. The family then moved to southern Tuscany, the Republic of Siena at the time, subsequently to the Duchy of Mantua, and ultimately to the Duchy of Savoy, which is the modern Piedmont region, plus bits of France and Switzerland. His wife, Eugenia Segre, was from another Sephardic family. They were bankers, and they arrived in Italy in the mid-1400s, probably via southern France. The 2 brothers, Leone and Samuele Levi, the 2 husbands of Benedetta de Benedetti, were from an Ashkenazi family that landed in the Duchy of Milan in the mid-1400s and then moved into the Duchy of Savoy when the Duchy of Milan came under Spanish control. Benedetta de Benedetti was descended from a certain man named Benedictus de Benedictus, Baruch ben Baruch, if you would have it, who first shows up in the documents in the 1540s, also of Sephardic descent. And then on the extreme right, Cesare Orefice came from Florence, so he's not part of the story. His mother was Rachele Montefiore, and I have never been able to figure out whether she is any relation to the British Montefiore or not. She also came from Leghorn, so I would guess the probability is high, but I've never been able to build the connection. And the last one there is Penelope Mirotti. She was Cesare's wife. They lived in Paris for most of their life, where he was a banker. She was not born Jewish. She was a convert to Judaism. and her father had been an engineer who had laid out much of the public transport network in the Victorian papal state. The Jews were already documented in Rome at the time of the Maccabean revolt. The Maccabees had sent a delegation to Rome to enlist help from the Romans to fight the Syrian Greeks. And when they got to Rome, they discovered a well-established local Jewish community. But in fact, the history of the Jews around the Mediterranean is surely much older. In the book of Jonah, we're told that he sought to escape from the service of the Lord. He went down to Jaffa, where he boarded a ship bound for Tarshish. Now, no one's quite sure where Tarshish is, nor are we sure that there ever was a real Jonah, but whoever wrote the story clearly established that there were important maritime commercial relationships. And if he was trying to get as far away from the service of the Lord as he could, he was probably thinking about the opposite, the western end of the Mediterranean. And this picture is a picture of the ruins of the synagogue in Ostia, which was the port of Rome from roughly 2,000 years ago. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, Italy, as I'm sure many of you know, was broken up into a collection of small principalities of varying sizes and populations. Some were very rich, some were not so rich, and so on and so forth. Benjamin of Tudela, who lived in the 1100s, visited a number of these communities, notably Genoa, Lucca, Pisa, and Rome, and possibly further south, as he went, as his ship sailed from Rome to Greece and from there on to the Holy Land. It's been estimated that the 10% of the population of Sicily in the 1400s was Jewish, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, who knows exactly. And there are now extensive efforts on to identify Jewish structures, mostly old synagogues and ritual baths, which have been repurposed to other uses, which seem to dot all over Sicily and southern Italy. And finally, for those of you who've read Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the mid-1300s, should note that about 20% of the stories included Jews or Muslims as major characters. And they're always portrayed as wise and benevolent, perhaps in sharp contrast with how the Catholic clergy was often portrayed in these stories. In the 1300s, Jews were being banned from France. It happened twice, once briefly in the mid-1300s and then definitively in the late 1300s. And that brought a population of Sephardim from southern France and Spain into northwestern Italy, up here near the Duchy of Savoy and related principalities. And at the same time, there were a certain number of Jews from Central Europe who migrated into the very rich Republic of Venice and to the Duchy of Milan, seeking better commercial opportunities than there were in Central Europe at the time. Later, in the 1400s and 1500s, a whole lot of Sephardim were, of course, leaving Spain, a story we all know very well, and also leaving from Portugal. In 1492, Sicily, which was a dependency of the Kingdom of Aragon in Spain, were banned as well. And so Jews began to migrate northward in Italy. In the early 1500s, the King of Naples was booted out of Naples by a French invasion, only to be put back on his throne by the Spaniards briefly thereafter, where he ruled as a Spanish puppet. And so Jews moved further north. And from roughly 1500 on, the Jewish population in Italy was from Rome northward. And there were substantial populations in all through the region, the ports on the Adriatic, in the Duchy of Milan, though not in the capital city where they were prohibited, in the Republic of Venice, and many of these other smaller principalities as well. It is said that the Pope welcomed the Spanish Jews to Rome in 1492 when they were booted out of Spain, and likewise the Duke of Ferrara welcomed Jews to his domains in the same year. Perhaps illustrative of all this movement was the Abravanel family, who were financial advisors to the King and Queen of Spain, and who had to leave in 1492. They initially went to Naples, where they were welcomed by the King of Naples. He was a well-known financier. He'd been a financial advisor to the King and Queen of Spain, and before that to the King of Portugal. But when the French chased the king out of Naples, the Abravanels went briefly to Sicily with him, but recognized they could not stay there. The family then split up, and their daughter went to Florence, where the Princess of Naples had married into the Medici family, and she lived with the Medici, while the Abravanel himself and his son wound up in the Republic of Venice. There were, as you can imagine, with these various Jewish populations converging on Italy and being concentrated in the northern half of the country, there were often separate congregations in the principal towns. So, for example, in Venice, there were 5 synagogues, one catering to the Spanish Jews, one catering to the traditional Italian Jews, one catering to the German Jews, one catering to the Levantine rites, and I forget what the 5th one did. And likewise, in Turin, in Italy, in the Duchy of Savoy, there were 3 congregations. In Ferrara, there were 3 or 4. Often they lived sort of separate but parallel lives, and sometimes they had their squabbles between the different communities. But these communities were all very well established and continued on into through the Renaissance and then continue on thereafter. How did my 5 ancestral families all end up in the Duchy of Savoy? This, I think, is a very interesting set of stories. Emanuele Sacerdote was descended from Abram Vidal de Sacerdotibus, as I mentioned earlier, who in 1490 landed in Alessandria, which was a border town in the Duchy of Milan, controlling a fair amount of the trade between the Duchy of Milan and the Duchy of Savoy. Clearly, there was an opportunity for trade finance. He was a banker. Eugenia Segre's ancestors, Elia de Segre, was first showed up in the Duchy of Milan in the city of Lodi, and then they then moved to Alessandria and subsequently to the Duchy of Savoy when Milan came under the control of the Spaniards in the mid-1400s. Benedetta de Benedetti, again, I mentioned earlier that her family also originated in Spain. They wound up in a town called Cherasco, which was on the main north-south trade route between the Duchy of Savoy and the Republic of Genoa. And as they built out their banking network over the ensuing years, they were all in towns along the chief trading routes, west into France and south into the Republic of Genoa. The Levi brothers were descended from a Simon Levitus, who in the mid-1400s showed up in the Duchy of Milan and the city of Pavia. Subsequently, as the Duchy of Milan was taken over by the Spaniards, the family moved first to Vercelli and then to Nizza Monferrato, both towns in this region right in here in the Duchy of Savoy. And the last, Manovello da Montalcino in the late 1300s moved from Rome into what was then the Republic of Siena in the town of Montalcino and established a banking network. His cousins, also from the same family, established another banking network based in Pisa, and they were in the ensuing couple of centuries established banking networks all across modern Tuscany and parts of the Papal State, what was then the Papal State and is now the province of Umbria. Now, the way that family ended up in the Duchy of Savoy is a very interesting story. At some point, one of his descendants, Daniele da Montalcino, entered into an unfortunate marriage, and his wife deserted him shortly after his wedding. And he subsequently moved to the Duchy of Mantua, which was up here, where his sister was married to another Jewish banker in that city. 2 of his grandsons then were sent off to the Marquisate of Monferrato, which at the time was a dependency of the Duchy of Mantua, to open a branch bank. And then after the War of Mantuan Succession, their city, San Damiano da Monferrato, was absorbed by the Duchy of Savoy, and they became bankers to the Dukes of Savoy. Now let's talk a little bit about Vitale de Sacerdotibus. He was the son of Abram Vidal, who we mentioned earlier, and he became the banker and economic advisor to Emanuele Filiberto, who founded the modern Duchy of Savoy. Emanuele Filiberto had previously been a general in the army of Charles V. He led the fight, the battle at Saint-Quentin, in which the French were decisively defeated. And he was also married to a French princess. And using both levers, the French and the Spanish levers, he was able to convince the French to withdraw the troops that had occupied his domains for the preceding 30 years during the dukedom of his father. And one of the first documents I found about him was that he donated a plot of land for a Jewish cemetery in the city of Alessandria with free rent for the superintendent, provided that he plant mulberry trees on the grounds. Now, at first I thought, why mulberry trees? The fruits aren't particularly nice and they're a mess. And then it occurred to me, he was trying to stimulate the start of a silk industry, which displays a little bit of his character. Subsequently, he became a close advisor to the Duke, and the Duke wanted to buy a large diamond to symbolize his power. And so he dispatched Vitale to Venice to buy him a diamond. And unfortunately, all the diamonds that were large and shiny enough to satisfy the Duke's lust for power were also too large and shiny to satisfy the Duke's bank account. So that effort failed. But he subsequently created a set of key economic development measures with the Duke. One was to grant mining concessions in the Alps. And there was assorted mining. A German consortium was brought in to start mining for metals in the Alps. Secondly, they'd had a currency reform in the old pound, shilling, and pence structure. Lire, the former pre-euro currency in Italy, was, of course, the old Latin libra for a pound of silver. They wanted to stabilize its value. They created a merchant fleet operating out of Villefranche. The Duke had the area around Nice and also the Alpine area in the Haute-Savoie were part of his domains. And the fleet was going to operate out of the small port of Villefranche near Nice. And lastly, they were going to recruit Jewish bankers and merchants to settle in the Duke's domains as a way of stimulating commerce, and with greater amounts of credit available, all sorts of enterprises could be begun. Vitale's son, Simon, was both a banker and diplomat. And he was in 1572, when the Duke issued his invitation for Jews to come settle in his domains, Simon was dispatched to Venice and then on to Constantinople on a diplomatic mission with secret orders to recruit the immigrants. And that process entailed his getting across the Duchy of Savoy. The Spanish spies in the Duke's capital of Turin had warned the Spanish authorities in Milan that this expedition was about to begin, and Simon had to escape, ducking the assassins that were sent to kill him. Then, when he crossed from Venetian territory into Turkish territory, the diplomatic party was attacked by Serbian bandits, and there was a big brouhaha amongst all the countries in that region in Europe over whose job it was to go punish the Serbs. And I was writing this just at the time during the wars in Yugoslavia, and I said, boy, things really don't change. Simon later took on another very important mission. In 1592, he made a daring trip to Spain. Spain had just defaulted on its debts for the fourth time in the 1500s. And this was shortly after the Spanish Armada went to the bottom of the North Sea. And I gather the King of Spain had borrowed a lot of money with which to build it and now could not repay it. And he negotiated new terms, of which one of the key terms was that the city of Alessandria in the Spanish-controlled Duchy of Milan was the only openly Jewish community in the global Spanish Empire for the next 150 years. Now, we had similar stories that we could learn about the others, and I won't go through all these in detail, but But for example, the Segre family at one point petitioned to regain the use of the coat of arms that had been granted when they were in Spain. They had family banks with branches along the trade routes to France and south. In the 1620s, one descendant of that family who was also a banker was murdered. And in fact, it was an ancestor of a good friend of mine in another town near where I live now, who was accused of being the murderer. But this division of his estate revealed an enormous amount about the scale of the banking operations, in which individual branches had capitals of tens of millions of dollars currently, and typically these banks would have had branches in 5, 10, 15 towns or cities. In the 1700s, the family branched into silk manufacture, and an interesting thing, which we'll come back to in a little while, they also had a child stolen by the church authorities and baptized against the family's will in the 1700s. Likewise, the story of the De Benedetti family, descendants of Benedictus de Benedictus, they were very active in both municipal finance and sovereign debt, also agricultural lending and trade finance. And one branch settled in Nizza Monferrato and later expanded into Alessandria after that town was ceded to the Dukes of Savoy at the end of the War of Spanish Succession. As I had mentioned earlier, the Montalcini family left Rome at the time when there were two competing popes. And as you can imagine, the stream of funds that used to feed the papacy in Rome was now divided in two, and so there were economic hard times there. And so they and another branch of the same family opened banks in what is now Tuscany, and those branched out into all the major commercial towns in their respective territories. And as I mentioned earlier, Daniele da Montalcino married a cousin, Clemenza di Vitale da Pisa, from the other half of the family, who promptly ran off with her lover, the son of a nobleman, and she had herself baptized, thereby annulling her marriage, her first marriage in the eyes of the church. And I'll give a lot of detail in a little while about this story, which was pulled together very brilliantly in an academic paper of about 30 or 40 years ago. Daniele eventually moved his bank to Mantua, where his sister lived with her husband, also a banker. He remarried and raised a family, and his grandsons opened a branch bank in San Damiano Monferrato, and San Damiano was ultimately ceded to the Duke of Savoy, and the Montalcini bankers became some of the most prominent bankers to the Dukes of Savoy and their area. This family also had a child stolen in the 1700s by the church. Now, you might ask, well, how did I pull all this together? And there was a brilliant piece of work that was done by a woman named Renata Segre, in which she spent, I think it was 13 years, going through all municipal archives, going through courthouse basements, going through royal archives, and so on and so forth. And she pulled together about 4,000 documents about the Jews who settled in the Duchy of Savoy in Piedmont from 1297 to 1797. And some of these documents, as I'll show you in a minute, some of them she merely summarized them. So for example, 1057 over here, which happens in 1572, the Council of Carrasco is unable to recoup the money it needed to pay off a debt to, turns out, one of the people who was in one of my ancestral families. And they had to go raise taxes in order to raise the money. The next one down is someone who is authorizing his father and his uncle to borrow money at a very high interest rate, and the expectation that they could re-lend it out at even higher interest rates. Some of the other documents were in fact reproduced completely. And document 1059 was the Duke's invitation for the Jews to come settle in his territory. And I'm going to actually swing ahead. Here we go. Here was the substance of that document. The Jews were going to have safe conduct and security for their persons, allowed to live in their laws, keep synagogues, keep their rituals, and the church was forbidden to conduct inquisitions into their affairs. And this document was basically copied from the Duke of Ferrara's 1492 invitation to the Jews to come settle in his domains. And there were a number of items in here that were particularly in opposition to church policy. For the church explicitly forbidden to conduct inquisitions into their affairs. Well, the church still liked to go censor their books, for example. They were protected from local taxes other than the excise taxes, such as the salt tax or the meat tax that everyone else has to pay. And they were immune from having to lodge soldiers in their houses. They could work as physicians. It was church policy at the time that Jewish doctors could not practice on Christian patients, even though a succession of popes in the 1400s had Jewish doctors. I don't know how they squared that one, but that was it. They could not be assaulted, and their children could not be converted against the parents' will. And more important, they could employ Christian servants, workers, and nursemaids, which meant that they could have household servants who lived in, even though that was also opposed to church policy. Another really critical source for me, there's been a school of Italian academics, many of whom were students of Professor Michele Luzzati, who was a cousin of mine who died 3 or 4 years ago. And he began to delve into archives, principally in central Italy, notably in Tuscany, and start to cross-tabulate names and events to unearth the detailed histories of the Italian Jews in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And for example, the story about Daniele da Montalcino and his short-lived wife started off, he found her marriage contract. Then he found the story of, in a church, he found the records of her baptism to cancel her marriage to her first husband. Then in the archives of the descendants of her second husband, discovered that he was, in fact, the second husband was a second son, and therefore was not going to inherit family lands, but in fact made his living by having a small private army of 12 mercenaries that he'd rent out to various Italian principalities for their petty wars. Ultimately, he found a document that showed that the second husband forced her father to extract her dowry from the first husband and give it to the second husband. And the final document that he found in a city hall somewhere showed that the girl's father and brother were accused of trying to murder her and her second husband. And he pulled all this together from a story that happened in 1480. Just an astounding bit of scholarship. One of the dark elements in the history of the Jews in Italy was the ghetto. The ghettos were first instituted in Venice in 1516, 1517. And the ghetto in Venice lasted until 1797, when Napoleon defeated Venice and took over the city, and the independent Republic of Venice was no longer a separate country. In the Papal State, the ghetto was established in the 1560s, 1550s, 1560s for Ancona, and it lasted in Rome until 1870. Now, in the case of Venice, there was something separately that was going on, a diplomatic issue between the Republic and the Pope. The Pope had established the Inquisition in Venice because Venice was a major center of publishing and a major commercial center, and there were a number of people with Protestant ideas who were settling in Venice, and books that were decidedly not to the church's liking being published. And Venice wanted the Pope wanted the Venetians to start burning people at the stake in city squares. Well, the Venetians made their money by doing business with the Muslims in the Turkish Empire, and burning infidels in city squares didn't seem like a smart business idea, so they refused. And ultimately, they achieved a compromise in which the Venetians would turn over the so-called heretics to the church. The church could do with them as they wanted. Typically, they were rowed out into the middle of the Adriatic and drowned, and so be it. And this happened simultaneously with the enclosing of the Jews into a ghetto. Was this a quid pro quo, a tacit quid pro quo? You will never know, but it was characteristic of the way the Pope and the Church behaved in its diplomatic relations going forward. So, for example, in 1571, the Duke of Florence wanted to be named Grand Duke of Tuscany. In that way, he would outrank all of the other Italian princes except for the Pope and the King of Naples. Simultaneously, and he asked the Pope to grant him this extra title. At the same time, the Jews in Tuscany were rounded up and put in ghettos, where they were locked off and put in locked off districts in the towns where they lived, and the gates were locked from dusk to dawn. Now, was this a quid pro quo? I don't know, but it sure smells and looks suspicious. In Piedmont, the Jews were put in ghettos actually in two steps. The first was in the capital city in Turin, which happened in 1679, when Louis XIV had decided to wage war against the Protestants in France, and his niece was the regent for the infant Duke in Turin, Duke of Savoy, and he convinced his niece that she had to lock up the Jews in the capital city and wage a war of extermination against the Protestants who lived in certain valleys in the Alps. And in the 1720s, the same Duke, who's now grown up and on his own, wanted to require the church officers to be subject to civil law. And he wanted to gain control of the public schools. And surprise, surprise, the Jews were rounded up in the smaller cities and put in ghettos. And there they remained until Napoleon opened the ghettos, and then they were again re-enclosed after the defeat of Napoleon. Another item, this was a document I found in my father's papers. It's a census of the Chieri Ghetto from 1838. And my great-grandfather appears, I think, on this page. Right now, I can't spot him directly. As an old man of 80, I'm not my great-grandfather, my grandfather's grandfather, great-grandfather, was a man of 87. His son and my great-grandfather, who was down here somewhere as a boy of 12 in 1838. And there were a lot of very interesting things in looking at various of these census documents. One is they always listed the people's religion, and occasionally one would find Protestants living in the Jewish ghettos. I said, well, I thought Christians weren't allowed to live under the roof of a Jew. But in the eyes of the church, the Protestants were heretics. They weren't Christians at all. It also listed people's birth cities, and typically women would be born in one city and marry a man in another city, which is a great way around the problems of incest in what was a small population and a small minority inside Turin. And you could learn in various different census documents also included occupations. They included the number of rooms in people's houses. They included number of servants they had, and all sorts of other very useful domestic information to help you build a story around those families. In addition to documents, my wife and I went on several tours, not tours, we traveled. And the first place we stopped again was the city of Chieri, where the Sacerdote family had lived since the mid-1500s. And we quickly found the ghetto, and outside, facing the main street outside the ghetto, was a plaque to the King of France, Charles VIII, who had invaded Italy in the 1400s. And he stayed with the noble Solara family, who owned that house in the 1400s, had an affair with one of their daughters, and that's all suitably memorialized on the walls of the city. The next picture is the main entrance to the house that was still being renovated. This would have been around 2005 or so. The third is a picture my brother took about 20 years before that in the 1980s. And there was a sign over the door that said that there used to be a statue over the door, but that was donated in 1876 by my great-grandfather, Emanuele Sacerdote, to the Civic Museum in Turin. And I'll come back to that story in a few minutes. The synagogue, which was just beginning renovation work, and it was going to be turned into a luxury apartment. I couldn't go inside, but here's a picture of it from the outside. In a couple of the parts of the building that had already been renovated, here's a beautiful Renaissance ceiling, and there were painters still touching up the paint on the ceiling. And in one room, there had been a plaster ceiling put up over the Renaissance ceiling in the 1700s, and part of the plaster had fallen down. And the developer did a wonderful job of first off renovating the artwork on the plaster ceiling, and then he kept the hole and he renovated the visible parts of the former Renaissance ceiling, and it's just a spectacular building. Going back to this statue, my wife and I went to Turin, and I called a cousin of mine who was on the city cultural council. I couldn't find the Civic Museum in any guidebook. So I asked her, I said, Piera, what happened to that museum? She said, I've never heard of it. Let me ask around. Call me tomorrow. So I called her back the next day and said, okay, I asked around. It merged with the Museum of Antiquities in 1927. I said, oh, I know where that is. That's in Piazza Castello, in the old Palazzo Madama. She said, yeah, but not so fast. And I said, what do you mean? She said, well, that museum's been closed for 30 years for renovations. So I said, all right, well, what do I do now? She said, call me again tomorrow. I'll make some more inquiries. Called her back the next morning and said, okay, here's the name of a certain professor who is curator of that part of the collection. And if you call him, he may be able to help you. So I called the professor and I explained the story. He said, oh, yes, we have your materials. If you come next Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock to a certain gateway in a warehouse outside of Turin, I'll show them to you. So we show up at 10 o'clock with my wife and two of my cousins from Argentina, and at the gate. And here's the man. He leads us in, and he shows us a shipping container that's packed floor to ceiling with rugs and with statuary and with artworks and so on. And on a wooden case next to it was the statue. This had the coat of arms of the Solara family. It was carved by an itinerant Flemish woodcarver in the 1400s, and it stood over the door as a way of projecting their importance in the city. And he said, do you want to see some other things? And he pulled out a case, a big wooden box. On the top, there were stars of David embedded in mother of pearl. And on the sides of it, there were inlay work of arbor vitae, the tree of life. And this was clearly a box that had contained some ritual objects, perhaps prayer books or whatever, in the synagogue in Chieri. It was just a beautiful, beautiful object. And it was really very satisfying to see this. In addition to that visit, another city we went to was Asti. And the synagogue is now disused, but the museum to it is still open. And we found this wonderful portrait of the segregated Jewish schools during the period of the ghettos. On the right, we see the schoolmaster and three studious boys and an angel showering candies on the boys. And on the left, another boy, maybe not quite so studious, getting a different sort of lesson. Another place we stopped was the city of Acqui Terme, which was a spa town. And we went to the Jewish cemetery there, and it was locked up tight. You could see in through the wrought iron gate. We didn't know what to do, so Carol and I went back into town, and she had the idea that we should go to City Hall, and they would be able to help us. And I said, yeah, right. So we were sitting out. The City Hall had just closed for lunch. We're sitting on a bench outside there, and a young man stops by, and he says, can I help you? And we explained what we're trying to do, and he said, well, look, I work here. I'm going home for lunch now. Come back at 3 o'clock and I'll see what I can do. And it turned out the key to the Jewish cemetery was held by the custodian for the Catholic cemetery. And he had the job of once a month going in and mowing the grass in the Jewish cemetery. So we borrowed the key from him. We went back across town, went to the Jewish cemetery, started wandering around looking at the various headstones. And I came across this particular headstone and I said, Carol, I know this man. And she said, what do you mean you know this man? He died 200 years ago. I said, no. He was the guardian for my great-great-great-grandfather, who was involved in a lawsuit when some other people were trying to encroach on their property rights in the ghetto. And he was a banker. And then I started reading the headstone. I found the other half of it as well. And putting the two pieces together, he had lived during the French occupation after Napoleon had invaded. He was in jail for a while. Then he was taken hostage, and ultimately he became a town councilor during the liberal period under the French. Turned out he was also a banker, and he had documented a lot of the experiences of what had happened in the ghettos at the time of Napoleon's approach. The Jews welcomed Napoleon because he was going to open the ghettos, but they started rebelling and refusing to pay their taxes. And the king had declared that the rabbis had to read a decree in which the Jews who didn't pay their taxes would be excommunicated. Well, the Jews occupied the synagogues and prevented the rabbis from reading the decree. And he documented all of this in one of the documents in Seged's huge volume. It's a wonderful story. Another stop was Casale Monferrato, which has a beautiful synagogue that dates to 1595. And it's still in use today. And in the synagogue museum, we found a cup very similar to one that I owned with exactly the same hallmarks. And this had been an item handed down in our family since the 1700s. And also, we found a Shaddai amulet. These were typically attached to cradles of infants to invoke divine protection for the newborn child. And theirs was almost identical to the one that had been in my mother's family since surely the 1700s. Another family piece, this is a chest of drawers that now belongs to my sister-in-law in New York. And the top of it had this beautiful inlay work in ivory of the patriarch Jacob with his dream of the angels climbing the ladder to heaven. I mean, just spectacular piece of work. Finally, in the 1831, the old royal family had died out, and a distant cousin of theirs, who was much more liberal, became king. And he began, initially, he retained his predecessor's policies. The very reactionary policies were instituted after Napoleon was defeated and the ghettos were reinstituted. Ultimately, he began liberalizing first the judicial system and the penal code. Then he introduced freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And at some point, in 1848, he freed the Jews and the Protestants from their respective ghettos, giving them full citizenship. And this is a plaque in the synagogue of Casale Monferrato celebrating that particular event. And with that, I think we can bring the story. Oh, let me just get one last sideline here. While this liberalization happened, and in 1848, the king was told by his advisors that he could either go along with the liberal movements all over Europe and grant a full national constitution and parliamentary government, or he'd probably lose his crown and die in poverty. So he chose to do that, and that launched then a series of events in which he started a series of wars for unifying Italy, which were finally completed in 1870, when his son, Vittorio Emanuele II, conquered Rome, kicked out the Pope, and ended the papal state, and made Rome the capital of Italy. While in 1848, the Jews in the Duchy of Savoy were liberated from the ghetto, in Rome, the ghetto continued on till 1870. And in fact, in 1859 was the last episode of Jewish child being stolen by the church. He was raised in the papal palace and ultimately died in 1940 in a monastery in France, just as the Germans were invading France, and would surely have been murdered as a Jew by the Germans had they caught him. So with that, I think I end my story, and I would welcome questions. Oh, one last slide. I have here the 3 books that I've written on various related subjects. The first is the one I've just talked about. The second is a memoir, my memoir of growing up biculturally and being part of the Italian Hebrew diaspora in the United States. And the third, a book I've just finished, just came out, is The Wisdom of Leone Levi. I had mentioned earlier that he had been raised in the ghetto, raised in segregated schools. Eventually, after 1848, was able to go to university. He became a lawyer, and then he became a public intellectual, and he took on everything from justice, reason, Darwin, you name it. And he was one of the last people who knew almost everything about almost everything when that was still possible. Sort of the last opportunity when that was still possible in the 1870s. So with that, I think I will end my discourse and take questions.
Great. Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Could you close your screen share, please?
Okay, let me blow this thing out to the whole screen.
Just the
if I
red.
can.
There should be red
Come
buttons
on.
to press.
Oh, there we go. No, that doesn't do it. Maybe I just catch the corner of this thing, I pull it out. There we go. Okay. Yes, sir.
It's still there. Shall I quickly do that?
Okay. Do we have any questions?
So let me just close that. Brilliant. Yes, I have a question. You said that the family, the Sacerdote family, came from Valencia. How do you
They
know
left
that?
from Valencia. That's as much as I know.
Where does that information come from? Because it's very early to know where people originated.
I don't remember. Uh, I really don't remember offhand. I'd have to go back and dig back through my research. Sorry.
Thank you. And another question, actually, which I should have known. Actually, I didn't. First of all, I didn't know that there was a Jewish community operating in Spanish territory. That was completely new for me. But the Levantine congregation in Venice. When they're saying Levantine, does that mean Romaniot or does that mean sort of Syrian Mizrahi? Do you know?
I believe it represents people who were merchants coming from the Ottoman Empire and therefore Syrian or from the Holy Land.
Okay, that's interesting. Ton, do you have something?
After 1848, with the emancipation of the Jews, did their situation actually improve, or were they still considered second-hand citizens?
Well, it was a very interesting statistic. Almost immediately, the Jews were, at least in Piemonte, I can't speak broadly, were taken up completely in socially. So, for example, the architect of the Italian unification was Count Cavour, who was prime minister to the king of Sardinia, the king of Savoy, and who became king of Italy. His immediate assistant was a man named Artom, who came from, I think he came from Alessandria. I'm not sure. I just don't remember. And he ultimately became minister of foreign affairs. The first Jew who joined, went to the military academy, was a man named Ottolenghi, and he ultimately became head of the military. So in the first generation, they acquired very important roles politically. They rapidly populated the universities, both as students and as faculty. By the time of the racial laws, it was estimated that 10% of the professorships in Italy were held by Jews, who were a minority of 1/10 of 1% of the population. I mean, the equivalent overrepresentation in the U.S., where we are 2 or 3% of the population, would be 200 or 300% of professorships in universities. I mean, it's just an astounding penetration.
I thought of a question just now. Did you make use of archives of Jewish communities? Do they still exist? How far back do they go? What is their situation right now? Are they
Okay,
with the communities
it's all
themselves?
over the map. A fellow named Shlomo Simonson at the University of Tel Aviv has been publishing a series of books. The 3 volumes of Renata Segeres that drove most of the information in my book was one example of that. So he did that across a number of Jewish communities in Italy. I know he personally did the Jewish community of Mantua. Unfortunately, their records got destroyed somewhat because Mantua was sacked during a war in 1628, 1630. but and now the school around Michele Luzzati, they are publishing dozens and dozens of papers, digging into all sorts of archives. He himself published during his lifetime probably 50, 60 papers, almost all about Jewish history of the medieval and Renaissance periods.
Yes. Is Renate Segre a family of yours?
I don't think she is. If she is, I've never met her for sure.
Mm. I've seen the book, and indeed, I'm impressed by the quality of her work and the length of it. It
Yeah,
covers 3 volumes of work.
yeah, yeah.
I see that Bernard Miller has his hand up.
Sorry, can I just jump in because there's a related question online. Is the physicist Emilio Segre part of the family?
Not that I know of. They're also a batch of Segre who are French, and when the families diverged, could be anywhere from 1450 to now. I mean,
Okay, thank you.
uh,
Sorry, Bernard.
Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation, which was A, fascinating, and B, absolutely remarkable and very romantic in a way. I have a couple of questions, a couple that are name related. Were the sacerdotes originally Cohens? And the
absolutely,
okay,
and I've taken the DNA test.
okay. And the Benedetta de Benedetti, who you said were Baruch Ben or Bat Baruchs, I have 3 8th, 9th, and 10th great grandparents who were Baruchs from Venice and Livorno. Would they have been, do you think, related?
I have no idea.
Okay.
Now, I will tell you especially during the post-ghetto period, there was a lot of cross feeding across communities in a way that there wasn't. You were largely limited to other Jewish communities in the same domain, in the same microstate as you lived in. But post unification of Italy, there was a lot of much broader cross fertilization. A good example is my Leone Levi's brother-in-law, Cesare Lombroso, was originally from Verona, and he married a sister of my great-grandmother, and he eventually became a professor at the University of Turin. And especially the academic posts. I mean, academic posts were scattered all over the place, and you had to compete for one. I had cousins who ultimately ended up in Ecuador, whose father had been a professor of medicine in Palermo, for example.
I have a question on that, but I worked in Nairobi with Roberto Ottolenghi, who was part of the Ottolenghi family, and he returned to Venice to become head of the Venice Restoration Commission. But I was intrigued to discover when I asked him where the name came from, that they were actually an Ashkenazi family, and Ottolenghi meant that they came from Oettlingen in Germany.
That's what Cecil Roth said in his book. I assume he researched it pretty carefully. He was a great scholar.
I have a conceptual question, and it's, well, no, I've got another question, which is you talked about Jewish doctors, and I'm fascinated by the role that Jewish doctors played, but also by the role of the University of Padua in the training of Jewish doctors at a time when Jews weren't being admitted to other universities. And I wondered whether or not you had come across in your research evidence of particularly doctors having trained there.
If I'm not mistaken, Cesare Lombroso was trained there, but I may be wrong on that. The early Jewish doctors in the 1500s were all trained in Spain and Portugal.
Yeah.
And then trying to think of, Leghorn never had a ghetto. It was the one city in Italy that did not have a ghetto. where there was a Jewish population. And that reason for that was it was opened in the 1590s when the port of Pisa silted up. The Grand Dukes of Tuscany opened Leghorn as a free port and openly invited Jews to settle there and live openly and comfortably, unlike the Jews who were locked in ghettos in Siena and Florence.
Okay, I did have another question. I'm not going to ask it because I've taken too much time, but I'd like to throw something in because Bruce has asked what happened to stolen Jewish children. And there is a film which has just won every award in Italy. It beat both Barbie and
Thank goodness.
yeah, and Oppenheimer in the Italian awards, and it's just going on release in Britain this week, and it is the story of the last of the children to be stolen by the Catholics and converted, and it is apparently a brilliant film. I will look for the name and post it in the chat.
The fellow in question was a boy named Edgardo Mortara from Bologna. And the family had a maid who was certifiably crazy, who claimed she had baptized him. And that was the church's excuse for kidnapping him.
Yeah.
And he was, I think, allowed once to see his family for an hour in the House of Catechumens several years after he'd been kidnapped, and never again could he talk to his family.
That's the film, and I will get the name and post it in the chat. And thank you again.
Thank you for your questions.
Bruce.
Yeah, thank you, George. This is great scholarship. I'm wondering, you name so many of the ancestors who seem to be in banking in different regions. And two questions. One, I saw in slide 13 a reference to secured lending as opposed to unsecured lending. What did that consist of? Did that mean access to the courts? Did that mean access to collateral that could be seized and resold? What did that mean? That's one question.
Here's a good example.
Go ahead.
If a city wanted to borrow money, say to build a bridge across the river, they could either pledge the proceeds of one of the taxes to pay off the debt, or the city council all had to personally guarantee it, or they could borrow money at 25 or 30%. Now, that unsecured lending meant unsecured lending, and often there were real troubles in trying to collect on that. And the documents are full of examples of that.
I could imagine. Which
and
leads
some
to
of that
second...
unsecured lending also bordered on pawnbroking at the low end. But most of these families, I think, with the possible exception of the Levy, were doing serious modern banking. I mean, municipal finance, corporate finance, sovereign finance, trade finance, agricultural lending. They couldn't take mortgages against land, but they could, for example, lend money against crops in the field or herds of cattle or whatever.
So two related questions. One is, did the Jewish lenders have access to the courts to enforce the collateral arrangement?
I believe they did. One of the things that I ran into in a couple of the documents was they were keeping their own books and records in Hebrew until that was banned by a civil court in 1624. The civil court basically ruled that, well, they'd have to hire interpreters to read them, and the interpreters were Jews, and they couldn't trust their being unbiased interpreters, and so they were forced to keep their financial records in Italian.
So you've anticipated my next question, and I'm not going to pull a Bernard here. It would be wonderful to see the borrowers from those records. Were those creditor-debtor records kept in some way that they could be read today to see who actually depended on the Jews to be the bankers for them?
In Segedis documents, there are a number of records, particularly of municipal finance, and also a number of documents about the difficulties of collecting on a debt that might span generations. Other borrowers clearly, for example, when Vitale was doing his economic policy for the Duke of Savoy, I suspect he was financing the mining operations, and I suspect he was also financing the commercial fleet coming out of Villefranche, probably syndicating that financing amongst other banks as well.
So did the records of all of that banking transaction activity exist? I guess
No, not much of that has survived. Okay. Harvard has a file of the Medici Bank, but post when the core Medici family went into politics and were no longer banking, a secondary branch of the family continued on banking for many years after. And somebody had bought that thinking they were buying the original records of the Medici's financing for the Pope, for example, and were very disappointed afterwards. So he donated the records to Harvard Business School.
Thanks so much, George. Thank you.
Is that Enzo? Enzo, you're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, that's great. Thank you, George.
Now, George, a comment was made. You had a slide about medical. No Jewish medical persons could take care of Catholics. I think that probably was in Venice, though I had heard that many popes had Jewish doctors.
Especially in the 1400s. Yeah.
The popes trusted Jewish doctors better than Catholic doctors.
Well, it's funny how that went back. The first translation of the old Greek and Roman medical texts from Arabic into Latin was done by a group of Jews. I forget whether it was in Spain or Sicily, or probably both. And so there was a small group of Jews who had access to the old medical knowledge of classical times. The other thing is, I remember I was reading, Yale has a program now to translate a lot of the great books that were written by Jews in the Renaissance. And I was reading Azaria de Rossi's book in translation, of course. And there's this wonderful incident in Venice in which a man lost his hearing, and he accused a woman of bewitching him and thereby destroying his hearing. And the judge very wisely said, well, let's have a medical exam of the man. And a Jewish doctor examined him and concluded that tertiary syphilis was much more likely than witchcraft as a cause of deafness. Enzo, back to you again.
Yes, a comment was made about Ottolenghi, about where the name came from. I had heard many sources of Ottolenghi, and one of the stories I'd heard, there was a printer from Germany, I forgot his first name, say Johann, and he ended up in Cremona as a famous printer of books in all different languages. And he probably changed his first name from Johann, say, to Giovanni. And he was from Ettlingen in Germany. And he Italianized Ettlingen to Ottolenghi. But that's a story I heard.
Let me add that Enzo is one of the authorities on the Ottolenghi family, and has done extensive research on that. And it was he who introduced me to Renata Segere's books. So thank you, Enzo.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions or comments to add, or we can close the meeting?
Actually, I have one comment I'd like to add, if I could.
Yes, of course.
A couple of months ago, I guess it's my age, but a number of my cousins have started writing memoirs and family histories as well. And one of my cousins from Mexico just finished a huge volume on history of her families, of which half of them overlap with mine, and particularly for the post-ghetto period and the fascist period. She has just marvelous amounts of detail from innumerable sources of privately held memoirs, from interviews with this, that, and the other person, and so on and so forth. It's just a remarkable piece of work. Her name is Liliana Lopez.
Thank you. Thank you. With that, I think it's probably time to end. Thank you so much. It was really enlightening and informative and interesting meeting. And perhaps at some future date you can come back and speak to us again. Ton, over to you to.
This was Sephardic World, brought to you by the Sephardic Genealogical Society. As always, we thank our patrons who make all of this possible. And we also say thank you to our viewers on YouTube. This was one of our best attended meetings so far. So I think the end of Pesach wasn't too much of a problem. Next week, we will have Raquel Levi Toledano. Sorry. In 2 weeks' time, we will have Raquel Levi Toledano. We will talk about Moroccan Jewish genealogy. And lastly, we thank George Sacerdote for a wonderful presentation. And I conclude with David that we hope to see you again sometime.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed giving this talk. And thank you to all of you who've tuned in.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.